Hi, this is Mike Roy with SmokeTutorials.com. Today we're going to talk about faking reflections. And as you know, Smoke's implementation of 3D is what I call sort of 2.5D. You have real geometry in there and it can generate 3D text. However, you don't have all of the things that you can do in a normal 3D program like Studio Max or Maya. It doesn't generate these reflections automatically, and you don't have a lot of control over surfaces and rendering options. So in this case we have some lights in our scene, and I have this reflection, sort of your standard shiny surface reflection that you see a lot now, kind of a motion flow implementation. You can use this for product demos or text setups or anything you'd like to do. And the great thing about this is you can have any number of things in your scene, and with a little manipulation you can create or fake some reflections in your scene. So let's get into this ConnectFX and see how I did this. Alright, so I have an action set up, and I'm going to go into F4 so you can see this is my main camera. So I have a camera that is doing this little animation. I've got a light in my scene, and let me go into schematic. Let me go into hit F4 to view my result, and here I'm going to basically hit my schematic. Zoom in a little bit. Okay, so we'll get into the batch setup later, or the ConnectFX setup later. In my main action, I have my default camera, which is doing the animation. As you see, I have some animation on X there, and it's a target camera, so no matter where you move it, it's just looking at that text. I have this 3D text here, and then I have a poly for my ground. And then I have a key light that's creating the main light in the scene, and then I have a fill light here. None of this really matters, it's just kind of your very basic 3D setup in Smoke. However, I'd like to add a reflection to this, and one way to fake a reflection on this 3D text is you can clone this text and sort of invert it, scale on -100, and move it down and things like that, but you'd have to do that for everything in your scene, and it's just a little bit cumbersome to do that if you have a lot of things in your scene. So what we're going to look at doing is we're going to create another camera that's sort of the inverse of this default camera. Now there's some assumptions we have to make here. One assumption is that this the ground plane we're looking at is essentially at 0 on the y-axis. And if we look into our action 3D views, if we go to the side view, we can see that this in this ground plane, it's living at exactly 0 in our scene. If I click that, we see it's on a y of 0. And then the same thing with the text. The very bottom of the text, this is the bounding box for the text, it lives at 0. Actually a little bit above, because this particular font, not all of the text was on a baseline. You can fix that by sort of splitting out this text if you wanted, and just sort of aligning all of those bottom characters to a baseline. That would help you out. So all of this is baselined, and then you may have seen I've got this other camera. So I've created a duplicate of this camera, and it's called RefleCam. And what I've done with RefleCam is I've copied or cloned its exact parameters from my main default camera. And how to do that is you select your default camera, down here on the right hit copy, and then in RefleCam you'd hit link. And notice that down here in this expression area, it's referencing default cam. So this means that all of the parameters that get animated when you animate default cam get also passed onto RefleCam. And then the second thing I've done is I've now inverted that camera on Y. And let's go back to our 3D side view. So if I unparent that axis, we see that both cameras are now perfectly aligned. And then when I parent this axis, it's now flipped on Y. And to do this, I just simply did a scale of -100. This essentially scaled the camera on a -100 axis. It scales the camera at a value of, so it inverts all of the XYZ data for that camera, and then I've rotated it on Y -180. So if we do that, then that essentially mirrors that camera in Y while keeping the top alignment of the camera. And if you look at another 3D view, actually let's go to a 4-up view. There's a side. Let's view this from the front, and then let's view this one from the top. So if you look at the top, those two cameras are precisely aligned, and then if you look at the front, they're precisely aligned on Y, but then in the other view, they're precisely aligned in Y, but then they're looking at the same space. And then if I animate this camera, then whatever I do is reflected and mirrored in the reflection camera. So let's look at the view of that reflection camera. What are we seeing in that reflection camera? Well, what we're seeing in that reflection camera is this, which is essentially the mirror image of what our main camera is seeing. And so that gets really handy because we can split that out and we can add multiple things in our scene, and that reflection camera is going to be seeing the reflection view of everything in our scene. Now, how do I actually use this? Well, I go to my outputs, and in your outputs you have, there's my main camera output. I've got my reflection camera output, and to do that I have this the poly 1 ground is grayed out. To select things to output, you would simply, to pass on to your outputs, you would simply edit output, or option E. That gives you this plus minus, and I can add or take away those outputs. So in main camera, I'm seeing everything. In reflect camera, I'm seeing the reflection. And then in my reflect camera, I also did I copied that output with copy, and I told it to set the type as matte. That gave me a matte for my reflection. And then finally, I have an alpha for my main camera view. So as you can see, I just was able to split out four different passes from that. And then out here is what I did with those passes. What I like to do, I just like to split out with mux nodes so I can label them, all the different outputs. And you can hold down Option Shift to bring up your advanced linking. And your advanced auto link, as you hold down that mux node and hold down Option Shift, you can auto link to any of those 4 outputs. So there's my reflection output. Here's my main output. There's my foreground matte. And there's my reflection matte. So now I can work with these different passes and do different things with them. And I would recommend turning off motion blur and anti-aliasing and things like that as you're working with these if you want to really speed up your workflow. And then you can always go back and render these, increase your settings. So then I've got my reflection, I've got my main output, and I just did a logic op set to a blend with a transparency of 20%. And then I'm using my using the matte, reflection matte, as the matte for this logic op. And then and then another thing you may notice I'm doing is I'm using Well, a couple of things down here, and the reason why I did a foreground matte is so that I could essentially occlude the output of the foreground, so that it would look like the foreground thing's knocking out the matte. You don't necessarily have to do that, but it just helps. You will have to do that if any part of your reflection is behind your foreground, if that makes sense. But I sort of moved it up so it wouldn't affect it. So that's what that logic I was doing. And then this G mask is sort of feathering, like a reflection would fall off as it gets farther away from the ground plane. I'm just sort of feathering that out, and then that gets me this reflection. And the cool thing about the cameras being linked is I can animate my camera however much I want, and it will update that. And let's go to set, and I have a context set. See this little C1, that means a context is set there. I did that by hitting Command and said set as context. And so if I go here and hit the 1 key, I'm seeing the result of my context. And the great thing about that context is I can go into action and the action schematic, and I can move around my default camera, click on my result view, my context view, and as I move my camera around, I can interactively see that context updating. You can go to 1 up and also see that even a little clearer. So that's a really nice. It takes a little bit to set up, but once you have your inputs and outputs set up, once you have your camera inverted, then as you add things into your scene and set them with set your render outputs to output the different parts of it, then you have a setup that you can easily add items to, and the reflection will update. So I hope that's helpful to you in your quest for doing 3D in smoke and sort of faking things. And if you have any feedback regarding this tutorial, please let me know at smoketutorials.com. Thanks for watching.